What if your entire life was planned before you turned 13? No dreams, no choices, just obedience, childbirth, and survival. In today's episode, we're diving deep into the grim reality of being a woman in medieval times, where the crown on your head didn't always shield you from pain, and your womb was your only worth. The medieval world was ruthless, especially for women. In the eyes of the church, they were temptresses, sinners, and second-class souls. Trust them? Never. Empower them? Absolutely not. From the moment a girl could walk, her future was already carved in stone. Obey your father, then obey your husband. No questions, no choices. Even queens wore invisible chains. Whether ruling a kingdom or living in a cottage, a woman's power over her own life was barely more than a whisper. And let's not sugarcoat it, the Middle Ages sucked. They weren't called the Dark Ages for nothing. No medicine, no antibiotics, no real laws to protect you, no technology, not even clean running water. Disease ran rampant, justice was brutal, life was short, harsh, and unforgiving. The medieval period stretched from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the spark of the Renaissance in the late 15th. That's 1,000 years of shadow, where progress slept and superstition ruled. But within that darkness were stories. Stories of courage, cruelty, and survival, especially from the women who lived it. The Middle Ages were not kind to women. In fact, cruel might be a better word. Early marriage wasn't just common, it was expected, especially for noble girls, who were seen as pawns in political games rather than people with futures of their own. Their marriages weren't about love. They were about wealth, heirs, alliances, and power. A girl was considered ready for marriage as soon as she could bear children, often around 12 years old. 12. Think about that. By modern standards, that's still a child. But in the medieval world, it was the beginning of her duty. Marry young, get pregnant, and do it again and again and again. Take St. Bridget of Sweden, for example. She was married at just 13, or Eleanor of Provence, wife of Henry III. She was 16 when she gave birth to the future King Edward I. Then there was Matilda, daughter of Henry I, married off at the age of 12. These weren't isolated cases, this was the norm. And if a noble woman was still single by 19, that was scandalous. Margaret of York, sister to Edward IV, was considered dangerously old when she hadn't married by that age. Even Catherine of Aragon, the future Queen of England, was just 15 when she married Arthur Tudor in a grand ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1501. The luxury of her wedding didn't change the reality. Her body was expected to serve a royal purpose. Now you might think, well, at least noble women had servants. Sure, but many women didn't. And even for those who did, there was no escape from the constant cycle of pregnancy, recovery, and caregiving. A noble woman's role was to endure. After childbirth, assuming she survived, her responsibilities didn't pause. Keeping a medieval home running was a full-time, exhausting job. Letting the fire go out wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. With no matches, no lighters, and paper being rare and expensive, reigniting a fire could mean freezing through the night. As for infant mortality, tragically common. So women were expected to have as many children as physically possible just to ensure that one or two might live past childhood. And what happened after marriage? That all depended on the husband. If he was kind, she was lucky. If he was cruel, well, there was no recourse, no legal protection, no divorce. Her life, her body, her fate, all in his hands. This wasn't just the fate of queens and noble women. It was the daily reality for most women, rich or poor, across medieval Europe. Their stories are rarely told, but today we bring them into the light. Royal blood didn't guarantee freedom. In fact, for many noble women, it was a curse disguised as a crown. Born into power, yes, but rarely allowed to wield it. Royal women were often nothing more than chess pieces, moved across the board of political alliances by fathers and kings who saw them as tools for treaties. Those who dared to be assertive might have carved out slivers of influence, but for most, obedience was the law. And if a noble girl couldn't be married off, Perhaps because her family couldn't afford a dowry, she was packed off to a convent, a silent exile, out of sight and out of shame. But the pain of these women went beyond politics and piety. It lived in their bodies. Childbearing was relentless. Women in the Middle Ages often had far fewer menstrual cycles than modern women, not because of better health, but because they were almost always pregnant. And we all know, giving birth is no walk in the park. Now imagine doing it without hospitals, without epidurals, without even a basic understanding of hygiene. Every birth was a gamble with death. Labor could last for days, even weeks. Breech births often ended in tragedy for both mother and child. C-sections. They existed, but they were rare, and almost always performed as a last resort when the mother was already dying, or worse, already gone. Success rates? Dismal. There were no obstetricians, only midwives. Courageous, yes, but untrained. They learned by doing, passing down experience like folk tales. They offered what help they could, often baptizing dying infants on the spot to save their souls. Some women survived childbirth, only to die days later from infections doctors wouldn't even identify until centuries later. And status offered no protection. Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, gave birth to a son, the future King Edward VI, only to die days later. Even queens weren't spared, but the tragedies of medieval womanhood didn't end in the birthing chamber. Society's view of women was a chaotic blend of control, fear, and hypocrisy. Take prostitution, publicly condemned, yet quietly tolerated. In early medieval France, women caught selling their bodies at night were publicly humiliated, paraded as a warning to others. Yet behind closed doors, the trade thrived. Some women were sold into brothels by their own families, desperate for income. Others chose the life out of necessity, to survive. Preventative measures didn't exist, so pregnancies were constant and unwanted. Many women abandoned their babies. Some were thrown away, and in certain brothels, archaeological digs have found infant graves. Nearly all male. The implication? Girls may have been spared, possibly raised to follow in their mother's footsteps. It's a grim picture, but a necessary one. These women didn't live in fairy tales, they lived in blood, sweat, and survival. Their stories were silenced for centuries, but not anymore. In the Middle Ages, disease wasn't just a medical condition, it was seen as a divine punishment. If you caught a sexually transmitted infection, society assumed you were guilty of something sinful. Prostitutes, adulterers, loose women, they were the first to be blamed. Never mind science. Morality was medicine, shame was the diagnosis. The most common STI of the era, gonorrhea. It had been known since ancient Greco-Roman times and was especially prevalent among women. And the consequences were devastating. Chronic pain, sterility, blindness in newborns whose mothers were infected, and a pus-filled misery that no one knew how to properly treat. Why? Because they didn't understand germs. The concept of bacteria wouldn't arrive for centuries. So what did they do? They turned to alchemy, superstition, and poison. Mercury became the go-to cure. Yes, mercury, one of the most toxic substances on Earth. It was smeared on skin, rubbed into wounds, and even injected into women in horrifying attempts to cleanse the disease. Instead of healing, people were poisoned, slowly, painfully, and publicly. Other so-called remedies included leeches and even blunt force trauma, striking the genitals with heavy objects in the hope of purging the infection. Imagine the agony. Imagine the fear. And if you were a woman, things got even worse. Women weren't just seen as sick, they were seen as the source, the carriers, the corrupters. Men who caught an STI, they blamed the women. And society backed them up. Women with infections were often cast out of brothels, thrown into the streets, publicly shamed, sometimes even accused of witchcraft. But punishment for so-called immorality didn't stop there. If a woman was accused of adultery, the consequences were horrifyingly brutal. Cutting off her nose and ears wasn't just a punishment, it was a permanent curse. a way to strip her of beauty, dignity, and identity. She would live her life mutilated, marked, so that no man would ever want her again. And yet, when a man cheated, he paid a fine, maybe. More often than not, he was simply forgiven. Public humiliation became a favorite form of control. Women accused of promiscuity or even just being too outspoken were subjected to the walk of shame, barefoot, dressed only in a thin petticoat, paraded through the streets filled with jagged stones and mocking faces. People would gather in droves, banging pans, hurling insults, spitting on her as she passed. Some women were dragged straight from their beds in the dead of night and marched through town under torchlight. No trial, no defense, just noise and cruelty. This wasn't justice. This was punishment by spectacle. In the medieval world, beauty could be deadly. Looking pale, ghostly pale, was all the rage. It symbolized nobility, wealth, and the fact that you didn't have to toil under the sun like common folk. But behind this porcelain perfection was a horrifying truth, because the secret ingredient to medieval beauty? Lead. One of the most infamous examples was Queen Elizabeth I. Known for her iconic white face, she regularly applied a substance called the Venetian ceruse, a deadly mixture of vinegar and white lead. It gave her that chalk-white glow that the court adored, but it also slowly poisoned her from the inside out. She wasn't alone. Women across Europe, especially those in high society, smothered their faces, necks, and chests in this toxic paste. It wasn't just vanity, it was survival. Looking pale wasn't just fashionable, it made you desirable. But the price? It was devastating. Long-term use of Venetian ceruse led to fatigue, abdominal pain, cognitive decline, organ failure, and ultimately death. And it gets worse. This makeup wasn't washed off daily like today's cosmetics. Oh no, it was left on the skin for days, sometimes an entire week, without cleansing. The skin would suffocate under the toxic paste, and if the poison didn't kill you, it disfigured you. Underneath the paint, skin turned gray, wrinkled, scarred. But women had no choice. When the makeup was removed, the damage was often so severe, they simply reapplied another layer, hiding their real faces behind a mask of death. It was a slow, silent killer, one worn with pride. In an age where appearance meant status and paleness meant power, many women literally died to look beautiful.